Welcome back to our full stack real estate project with Next.js. In this series, we are creating a full stack real estate application with the state-of-the-art technologies like Next.js 14, Supabase, and Prisma. This video is the second part of this series in which we are going to continue our development of this project. We will complete the add property page and you will learn how to handle forms in Next.js, how to enforce the form validation, and how to create several actions in the right way. We will also create our user property page where user can see, edit, and delete its added properties. And in case you want to see the first episode of this series, I put a link to the first episode in the description below. Welcome back to the Sakuradev channel where you will learn the state-of-the-art technologies in the web development field. So now without further ado, let's get right into it. Episode of this tutorial, we have created this nav bar and we also set up the authentication with our Next.js application. We can sign in with our Google account here. Okay, now that we have signed in into our application, we can go to the user properties. Note that this is the final version of the user property page. We haven't created this table and its pagination in our tutorial yet, but we are going to create it in this episode. But before doing that, we need to complete the add property page. So I go to the add property page, and in the previous episode, we have created the first three steps: the basic step, location step, and feature step. So let's fill up the basic step inputs. Okay, go to the next step, fill up the data with some dummy data here. Also here, put some dummy data. And now we are in the picture step of the application. Now here we are going to continue our design from this step in the add property page. So if you haven't watched the first episode of this tutorial, I recommend to watch it first through the link in the description below. So here, this is the final version of the picture form. We can click on the upload file and choose our images. And you can see we have the image here and we can select another one. Okay. And we can delete some images here. Let's add another one. So here in this section, we are going to create this form. But before doing that, we need to create the property image model in our Prisma schema file, which actually keeps the URL of each image relating to each property. So now let's go back to VS Code and go to the prisma.schema file. Okay. And now here we are going to create the property image model. So here I'm going to add a model, name it property image. It is going to have an ID, which is going to be int, and it is the primary key of the table. And let's mark it with the default and call the auto increment. So it's a auto increment ID. Then we're going to have the URL in which we are going to keep the URL of the uploaded image about each property. So it is going to be a string. Okay, now let's go to our diagram tool and add this property image model into our database diagram. So I go to the browser and go to the diagram tool here. So let's add the property image model here. I'm going to add property image. It is going to have an ID, which is going to be int, and it's the primary key of the table. Then it is going to have URL, which is going to be string. Okay, and now we need to create the relationship between the property model and the property image. So here, let me explain what type of relationship we need to create between the property model and property image. Each property can have multiple images, but each image only belongs to one property. So guess what type of relationship we need here? This is a one-to-many relationship between the property model and property image, or actually it is a many-to-one relationship from the property image to the property model. So here, since it is a one-to-many relationship, we have to put the foreign key on property image model. We can't put it on the property model. So unlike the one-to-one relationship, we cannot freely choose where to put the primary key. It has to be on the table that is on the many side of the one-to-many relationship. So I hope that makes sense to you. And here in the property image, we're going to have a property ID. It is going to be int. Okay, and then here inside the relationship section, we're going to say image.id and choose the relationship type here. We're going to have a many-to-one relationship from the property image to the property, or we can have a one-to-many relationship from property to property image. So here I just choose the many-to-one here and then choose the other side of the relationship, which is the property, and then choose ID. So property image.id will refer to the property ID. Okay, so as you can see here, we have a one-to-many relationship let's zoom in, you can see it better. We have a one-to-many relationship from property to property image, or many to one relationship from property image to property model. So now let's implement this relationship in our Prisma.schema file. So I get back to the VS Code, and here we're gonna have a property field that its type is from property. So let's save this, and you can see it creates the property ID for us and the relationship which says that property ID from this table, this property ID will refer to the ID of the property model. And if I go to the property model, you can see it creates the property image and set its type to a list of property images. So I just prefer to rename this to just images, and let's save this. And note that here, since this is a one-to-many relationship, we need to have a list of images on the one side of our relationship, which is property, and here in the many side of the relationship, we shouldn't mark the foreign key with @unique. It should take duplicated values because each property with one ID can have multiple images, so it should not be unique. So let's save this, and that's it for the property model. And now we can run a migration here. So I'm going to say npx prisma migrate dev and then -- name, just say adding images. Let's run that, and it's done. And now we have a property image model in our database. So that's it for this section, and now we can move on to the next section, which we are actually going to create the form of the property images. Okay, so let's get to the final version of the add property form, and here in the picture section we need to design something like this. I have shown the functionalities of this form in the previous section, so I just go to the VS Code, and here I go to the components directory of the add property form. Here let's create a new component. I'm gonna call it picture.tsx. Let's create the component here, and here in the first step we need to create the interface for the props of the component. So I go to the location, and here just copy this interface, get back to the picture, paste it here. Okay, so for now this is the props of the component. We're gonna get back here just in a second and add more property to this interface. So for now, let's have the props inside the picture component and set its type to props interface. Okay, now here we're gonna have a card here. Okay, first we need to set the class name here, use the cn function, and then for now let's just put the props.class name. Okay, so the parent component can set the class name for this component. And now here inside this card component, first we need to put a file input. So I'm going to put a file input here. So the file input is imported from the components directory inside the app directory. And for now we need two more properties in the props interface. So here first we need a images, which is actually the list of files that the user has selected to upload. Okay, and then we're gonna have a set images that take a list of images, which actually is a list of files, and it returns nothing. So we need to define a state for images and set images in the parent container, which is the add property form. And then when we are rendering the picture component, we're gonna need to set these two properties. So we are actually keeping the state of this component on the parent component. So here, let's get back to our file input. We're going to set the onSelect prop and set it to a function that takes e, and I'm going to call the props.setImages. So let's rename it to setImages here. Let's get back to the file input, and here we are going to put the selected file in the images list. So I put a list here. First we need to cast the e as any, and then from it put the target.files, set the index of 0. So we are actually putting the first selected file by the user in the file input, and then after that we're going to spread the props.images. So actually we are appending the selected file by the user in our images state. Okay, we're done with the file input here. So now let's go to the add property form and put the picture component in the add property form. So I just copy the features here and paste it here and just replace it with a picture component. Okay, and then we need to set the images and set images. So So first we need to create a state here. So I scroll up to the beginning of the component, and here let's create a state for images, const images and set images. Okay, and then set it to use state and define its type, which is a list of file, and then as initial value we're going to pass a empty array. Okay, now let's get back to the picture component, and here we need to set images to images and also set the set images to set images function. Okay, now we're done here, and all we need to do here is to change the condition of the class name to step is not equal to 3. Okay, now let's go back to the browser, and here let's go to the picture section. We have the upload file, so let's add some padding to our component. Get back to VS Code and go to pictures. Here in the cn function, and the first parameter, let's add some padding, for example p3. Let's get back to the browser. Now it is much better. Okay, now we need to render the selected images here below the upload file. So let's get back to VS Code, and in the picture component, here we're going to loop through the images and render them here. So for each image, let's create a picture card. So in the components directory of this route, we're going to create another component. Let's call it picture card.tsx. Let's create the component, and here let's create the interface for the props, and it is going to take the src, which is the URL of the image. So it is going to be string, and here in the picture card, let's extract these src from the props. So first let's set the type of the props to props interface that we have just created, and then extract the src out of it. And then here we need to put a card element. Okay, import it from the Next UI, and inside this card component, first let's create a image component. Okay, and then let's set the src to src prop. Okay, now we're going to set the class name here. We're going to set the width and height of the component w36 and h36. And we're going to set the object field of the image to contain. So we use the object contain here. Okay, now let's get back to the picture component, and here let's have a div here. After the file inputs, let's set the class name. We're going to set it to flex and gap 3 for the space between the images, and also flex wrap. Okay, now we are going to loop through the images. So here I'm going to say props.images.map. Then we're going to have the image, and then for each image we're going to render a picture card that we have just created. So here I render a picture card and set the src prop to URL of the uploaded image. So in this step we haven't uploaded file yet. So we need to create a URL of the image, and then we can set the src props. So in order to do that, I use the URL class and then call the create object URL and pass the image file. Okay, and here we also need to set the key of the picture card to just src. So let's moving the URL.create object file out of this component, and here let's turn it to a block here, and here we need to use the return keyword. Okay, and before rendering the picture card, we need to define the src. So I'm going to say const, for example, src URL, and set it to URL.create object URL, and now we can put the src URL here in the src props, and in the same time we can set it as the key of the picture card. Okay, now let's get back to the browser and go to the picture section. Let's upload a file here. Now you can see the image is here. So let's upload another one. Awesome. And we're going to have another one. Okay, so this is for the uploading file, and now we need to add a delete feature for each picture card, so we can delete images that we don't want. So I go to the picture card here in the components directory. After the picture card, we need to render a button, just plain button, not the button from the Next UI. And then inside it, we're going to render a trash icon that comes from the hero icons library. Okay, let's set the class name here. We're going to set the color to text danger 400 and W4 for its width. Okay, now in the onClick event of the picture card, we need to just send out the index of the picture, and then in the parent component, which is the picture, we're going to delete the selected image from the image list. We're not going to delete the image directly from this picture card. So here in the props of the component, we're going to have a index, which is going to be number, and then we're going to have onDelete, which is going to be a function which takes the index, which is going to be number, and it returns nothing. So this onDelete is actually an event that when the user clicks on the delete button, it will be called. So here on the onClick event of the button, we're going to call the onDelete function. So first let's extract the onDelete here in the props and also the index. So here we're going to call the onDelete and pass the index of the selected picture. So now let's go to the picture component, and here first let me set the index to the index of the image. So here in the map function we need to extract the index. So we're going to have the index of the image, and then we're going to pass it to the index prop of the picture card. And also we need to set the onDelete. So we need to set it to a function that takes, for example, I. So the I is actually the index of the selected picture card. And then here we can remove the selected images with the index I from our images list. So I call the props that set images, and we're going to pass a list here, spread the props that images that slice from 0 to the selected index, which is I, and then spread the props that images from the index of I, and so on. So we forgot to call the slice function here. Okay, so let's close the Explorer, and now here with this parameter of the setImages function, we are actually removing the image with the index of I from our images list. So let's get back to the browser. Now we have the trash icon here. Of course we need to put some style here to move it to the center, but for now let's just click on this image, and you can see it is deleted from the images list. So it works properly. Now let's go ahead and move this trash icon to the center of the picture card. So I get back to the VS Code and go to the picture card component. Here in the card, we need to add a class name. We're going to have flex and flex cool, and then we're going to have item center. Okay, let's save this and let's get back to the browser. Now we can see it is on the center. So let's have some margin after the button. So inside the button, we're going to have a class name, and we're going to use margin below to 2, for example. Let's save this, and now it is much better. So yeah, that's it for this section. And in the next section, we are going to create the contact part of the add property form. In this section, we are going to create the contact part of our add property form. So first we need to create the contact model in our Prisma.schema file and add these 3 fields inside it. And then we can create this form and put it in the add property form. So now let's go to the VS Code, and I go to the Prisma.schema file. So here we are going to create the contact model. So I'm going to say model contact. It is going to have an ID, which is int, and it's the primary key of the table. And let's set it to our increments. Okay, we're going to have name, which is going to be a string. We're going to have phone, which is also a string, and we're going to have email, which is also a string. So now let's go to our diagram and add this model inside our diagram. So here, let's zoom in. We're going to create the contact model. It has ID, which is int, and it is going to be primary key of the table. So let's scroll up here to see the contact model here, and let's add the other fields. It has name, which is a string. It has phone, which is string, and it has email, which is also a string. So now we need to create the relationship between the contact model and the property model. So each property needs a contact information on our system. So we can create a one-to-one relationship between the property and the contact. So here we need to add the primary key. We're going to have property ID in the contact, property ID, which is going to be int, and then let's create the relationship here. We're going to have contact that property ID, choose the type of the relationship one-to-one, and the other side of the relationship is property, and we are going to refer to the property ID. So now here we have the contact, and you can see we have a one-to-one relationship between the property and the contact model. So now let's go back to the Prisma here, and let's create the relationship here. So we're going to have property and set its type to the property model. Let's save this. It immediately creates the property ID. Let's mark the property ID, which is our foreign key, with the unique decorator because it's a one-to-one relationship. And here you can see it creates the contact in the property model. So since it's a one-to-one relationship, we need to remove the list here and mark it with question mark, which is going to be optional, and actually change the first letter to lowercase. Okay, let's save this and run the migration here. npx prisma migrate dev and then -- name, adding contact. Okay, now the database is in sync with our Prisma schema, and now we can go ahead and create the contact form in our add property form. So this is the contact form, and we are going to create this form in our add property form. So I get back to the VS Code and go to the components directory of the add property form. We're going to create a new component called contact.tsx, and then here let's create the component. First we need to define the interface. So I just go to the location and just copy the interface here and get back to the contact and here paste it. So here we don't want the next prop because this is the last step of our form. We just need the prev and class name. So here we're going to extract the prev and class name from the props. First, let me set the type of the props to the props interface and then extract the prev and class name. We're going to render a card component here. We're going to have the class name. We're going to use cn function. So as you know, the cn function is combination of the CLS6 and Tailwind merge. So in the first parameter, we're going to put our own class name, and in the second parameter, we're going to put the class name that we've got from the props. So in the first parameter, we're going to have a grid system, and we're going to have grid col1 for responsiveness, and on empty screen above, we're going to have 3 columns, okay, a gap 3 for the space between the columns, and p2 for padding. And let's just save this, and inside it we are going to put the inputs. So let's put the first one and set the label for it. It is going to be for the contact name here. Let's put the second one. It is going to be for phone. So let's set the label here, and we're going to have the third one, which is going to be email. And then we need to put the buttons in the component. So I go to the location and just copy the button section. Go to the contact here, put them here. Let's import the missing imports, and let's set the onClick event of the previous to prev prop. And here we don't want the onClick event. And here in the next button, it should be save here. Okay, we don't want the onClick event since we are using a form here. We just need to set the type of this button to submit. Okay, so you might ask, where is the form? The form is on the parent component, which is the add property form. Okay, so this is the form here, and we're going to handle the form submission from the parent component. So let's get back to the contact here. We're going to change the icon of the component to something like plus circle icon and save this. And now we can go to the add property form and just copy the features here. After the picture element, we're going to render the features, and we need to replace it with the contact component. Okay, we don't need the next here, we just need the prev here. And here for the condition of the class name, we're going to set it to step is not equal to 4. Okay, now let's get back to the browser. Okay, go to next section, next. Oh, we forgot to put the next and prev buttons on the picture component, so let's quickly add them. I get back to VS Code and go to the features component and just copy this section, which is for buttons. Go to pictures, and after the div here, which we render the pictures, we're going to put the buttons, and let's add all missing imports. And let's go back to the features here, and for the next button, we just need to put the props next. Okay, let's get back to the browser. Now we have the next buttons here. Let's add some margins here. So inside the div here for the buttons, let's have margin top, for example, 3. And get back to the browser, click on the next. We have the form here. Okay, so this is our contact form. We need to put the buttons to the center of the form. So let's get back to the contact component, and here we're going to span the div that contains the button on 3 columns because we have 3 columns here. Now it is better, and then we need to change the color of the save here. So in the save button, let's change the color to, for example, something like secondary. Okay, so the color of the save button is now changed. So that's it for this section. Now we have created all these steps of the add property form, and in the next section we are going to integrate the React hook form with the add property form. In this section, we are going to use React hook form for form submission, and we are going to create a server action for inserting a new property into our database, and also we are going to use Zod package for form validation. So let's get into it. So let's get back to VS Code, and here we're going to install the packages that we are going to use in this section. So here I'm going to say npm I React hook form, and then add hook form /resolvers, and also Zod package. Okay, so let's install these three packages. Okay, in the first step, we need to create a form schema with Zod package, and then we are going to pass it to the React hook form for form validation. So let's close this off here. And now let's go to the lib directory. Let's create a file here. We're going to call it Zod schema.ts, and then here we are going to create our form schema and export it from this file. So we're going to say export const add property form schema, and then set it to Z, which comes from the Zod package, and then call the object function. So this is going to be a Zod object, and here inside it we're going to pass our object, and in this object we are going to specify the values of our inputs in our form. So if I go to the database diagram here, we don't want the ID, user ID. We're going to take the name, description, price, type ID, and status ID from the first step of our form. So here, if I go to the basic step of our add property form, you can see we have name, description, type, status, and the price. So let's get back to the Zod object here. We're going to have a name, which is going to be a Zod.string. We're going to have description, which is also a Z.string. We're going to have type ID, which is going to be Z.string. So if I go to the database diagram, you can see the type ID is type of int. But here, since the value that we are getting from the input component is a string, we're going to set it to a string. But we need to transform that to an integer. So we need to transform the string value to a number. So we're going to change the transform function, and here we need to pass a callback. We're going to have the data, which its type is unknown. So let's set its type to unknown, and let's put it inside a parenthesis, and then it just return the number version of the data. Okay, so with this number function, we are actually casting the data to a number. So now the type ID will be a number. We're going to do the same with the status ID. So we just copy the type ID here, and we're going to rename it to status ID. Okay, we're going to have the price, just copy that and just rename it to price here. Okay, so now let's get back to the browser. We are going to take the locations here. We don't want the ID. We are going to take all the fields except the ID, which is our primary key, and property ID, which is the foreign key. So let's get back to browser. Here we are going to create a location object inside the main object. It is going to be a z.object, and then pass the object inside it. So inside it, first we're going to add the street address, which is going to be a z.string. We're going to have city, which is also z.string. Let's copy that. We're going to have state in the same way. So just rename that to state. Copy that. We're going to have zip here, region. So we rename it to region. And the last one is going to be landmark. So just copy that and just rename it to landmark. Okay, so this is the location object inside our add property form schema object, and then we are going to have the property features. So we are going to take all of these properties here except the ID and property ID. So let's get back to the VS Code, and here let's have a property feature, then set it to z.object and pass the object itself. It has the bedrooms, which if I go back to the diagram here, you can see its type is int, so we need to transform the value to a number. So I just copy this code here and paste it here, and just copy that for the second one and rename it to bathrooms. copy that. The next one is going to be parking spots. Okay, now let's go and add the area. So just copy the last one and rename it to area. Then we're going to have 3 Boolean values: has swimming pool, has garden yard, and has balcony. So let's get back to VS Code, and here let's have has swimming pool, okay, and set it to z.boolean. We don't need to cast the type to Boolean because we are going to take the value of this field here from a checkbox component which returns a Boolean. So we don't need to cast or transform the value of this field. So let's copy that and change the name to has garden yard, copy that and change the name to has balcony. Okay, now we're done with the property feature, and then we're going to have the contact values. So let's get back to our schema. In the contact, we just need the name, phone, and email because we only get the name, phone, and email from the contact form. So let's get back here and create another member for this schema, which is contact. It is going to be a z.object, and let's have the object inside it. We're going to have name, which is going to be z.string. In the same way, we need phone here and also email. So with the email, we just need to change the email function, which makes sure that the value must be an email. And for the validating the phone, we can use a package called validator. So let's open up the terminal. Let's clear this up and install a package called validator. Okay, now we can use the validator package for validating the phone here. So now we can chain a function with the phone, which is refine. So inside this function, we're going to return a Boolean, true or false. If we return true from this function, we are saying that the phone value is valid and accepted. And if we return false from this refine function, it means that the value of the phone is not valid, and we are telling the Zod here that it should not accept the phone value because it's not valid. So in other words, in this refine function, we're going to decide if the value of the phone is valid or not. So here we can use the validator package. So let me show you. We have a function inside the validator. I'm going to use validator. So it can't be found. We need to install the types of the validator. So here I'm going to use npm I add types /validator and then -- save dev because it's a dev dependency. Okay. Now here you can see we can access to the validator here. Okay, let's import that. And here we have a is mobile phone function. So inside it we can pass the phone number as a string, and if it is a valid phone number, it will return true, otherwise it returns false. So inside this refine function, we're going to need to pass a callback that takes the value of the phone, and it should decide whether it is a valid phone number or not. So as I said, this callback should return false or true. So instead of the callback here, we can pass this validator.mobilephone. So let's cut that from here and paste it here inside the refine function. So this function is now our callback that takes the value of the phone and returns true or false based on the phone value. Okay, so here we can also pass a custom error message in case of this function return false. So we can say something like, please enter a valid phone number. We can also put custom error messages to all of these members here, but for speed up the process, we just go for the default error message of each function. Okay, so that's it for the add property form schema, and now we can use it for form validation in the React hook form. So let's save this and move on to the next section, which is about integrating the React hook form with our add property form. In this section, we are going to integrate the React hook form with this add property form. So here, as you can see, we have just one form and split the inputs of the form into 5 sections: the basic, location, features, picture, and contact. So instead of having just 5 forms, we just have one form, and then we're going to use the form provider of the React hook form and get the values of the form from each input inside of these 5 sections. So now let's go and use the React hook form library. So I go to the beginning of the component, and we're going to call the use form hook that comes from the React hook form. And then we need to specify the type of the inputs. So we're going to infer the type from the add property form schema that we have created in the previous section with Zod. So outside the form here, we're going to define a type, and let's name it add property input type, and we're going to infer that from the add property form schema with the z.infer. So let's import the z here from Zod and then use the infer, and here in the angle brackets we're going to put the type of the add property form schema that comes from the /lib/Zod schema file. Okay, now we can use this type in the use form hook. So I'm going to put the add property input type and then here pass the configuration object and set the resolver to Zod resolver. So let's import the Zod resolver from the hook form /resolver/Zod. Okay, and then we're going to pass the add property form schema. So this is the form schema and this is the type that we've inferred from the form schema. So don't confuse between the input type and the form schema here. Okay, so we need to set the returning object of this use form hook to an object called methods. So I'm going to say const methods. Okay, and then here, in order to be able to get the input values in the form, we need to wrap the form with a form provider. Okay, form provider that comes from the React hook form, and then here we need to spread the methods that we've got from the use form hook. Okay, then we're going to wrap the form here with the form provider. On each of these components, contact, picture, features, location, and basic, we can access to the methods of the React hook form. So if we had the input components of the form directly as the children of the form component, we would not need the form provider. But here, as you can see, the actual inputs of the form are on the separate component, basic, location, pictures, and so on. So we need to use a form provider, and then inside each section we can access to the methods of the form provider. So now let's go to each of these components and bind the inputs with the methods of this form provider. So first I go to the basic component, and here in the component we're going to call the use form context, which comes from the React hook form, and then we need to pass the inputs type in the angle brackets. So let's get back to the add property form and export the add property input type. So let's export it here. Okay, and now we can access to this type in the basic component. So in the angle brackets, we're going to pass the add property input type. Okay, and then we can access to the methods of the hook form. So now let's extract the methods from the returning object of the use form context here. Okay, here we're going to extract the register and form state, and in the form state we're going to extract the errors. Okay, now we can bind each input with the register function. So I go to the first input here, it's the name input. First we're going to use the register, so I spread the returning value of the register function and then pass the name of the field, so it is going to be name. Okay, and now this input is connected with the name of the add property form schema. The input type of the Next UI has an error message, so we can set it here, error message, and set it to errors that we've got from the use form context that name that message. Okay, and here we can specify is invalid prop, which actually, if it is true, it turns the border color of the input to red. So you can set the errors that name, and in order to make sure to turn it to a boolean, we're going to use 2 exclamation mark before it. So if the errors that name is existed, it will return true, and if it's undefined, it will return false. Okay, that's it for the first input, and I just copied these 3 lines here and go to the second input here, the text area. We're going to put them here. We just need to bind it with the description, and let's copy the description and put it here and also here. Again, let's copy these 3 lines and go to the next input, which is the select input. So let's here bind the select input with the hook form. First we're going to bind it with the type ID, and let's copy the type ID and paste it here and here. So as you can see here, the value of each select item is the item.id, which is actually the property type.id. So the value of the type ID will be the ID of the selected type inside the property type select input. So we're going to go ahead and copy these 3 lines and go to the next select, which is about the status. So I put them here. We just need to bind them with the status ID, copy the status ID and replace it here and here. Just copy them again and go to the next input, which is for price, and paste it here. We just need to bind it with the price. Okay. And just copy that here and here. So that's it for the basic component. Let's save this, and I go up here and copy this use from context here and go to the next component, which is location, and put it here inside the location component. Okay, let's import the missing imports, and let's get back to the basic component and just copy these 3 lines for binding each input to its associated field inside the form schema. Get back to the location, go to the first input and bind it with the location dot street address. Okay, just copy that and put it here. We also need to add a question mark here because it might be undefined, and put it also here. Okay, now just copy the code here and go to the next input and paste them here. It is going to be location dot zip code. Just copy the zip here and put it here and put it here. Okay, copy them again and go to the next input, which is city. Okay, let's change the zip to location dot city. Copy the city and paste it here and here. Again, let's do the same for the next input, which is the state input. Okay, change it to location dot state. Just copy the state here, paste it here and here. Again, let's do that with the next input, which is the region input. Just change the location dot state to location dot region. Just copy the region here and paste it here and here. Again, let's copy this and go to the next input, which is the landmarks. So let's paste them here and here. We are going to bind it with location dot landmark. Paste it here and here. Okay, let's save this and go to the next section of the add property form. So before doing that, let's copy the use form context here and go to the features component, paste it here in the beginning of the form, import all the missing imports. Okay, get back to the location, just copy these 3 lines of code for binding each input to the associated field inside the form schema. So the first one is going to be bedroom. So let's put them here and just bind it with the property feature that bedrooms. Just copy that here and paste it here, and also here we need to add a question mark here. Okay, now let's copy these 3 lines of code and go to the next input. It's for bathrooms, so let's change it to property feature dot bathrooms. Just copy that and put it here and put it here. Fix that and just copy that, go to the next input, put it here, just bind it with the property feature dot parking spots. Okay, put it here and here. Again, copy that and go to the next input, which is for the area. So let's bind it with property feature dot area. Just copy the area and put it here, and also put it here. And then we have 3 checkboxes here that we need to bind them with their associated fields inside the form schema. But here we can't use the register function to bind these checkboxes. It's a controlled input, so we need to use the controller component from the React hook form. So here, first we need to extract the control from the use from context. So I just extract it here, and then each text box here need to be rendered inside the controller component of the React hook form. So I use the controller component, which comes from the React hook form. Okay, and then here, first we need to set the control to the control object that we've got from the use from context. Okay, and then we're going to set the name here, which specify which field of the form schema that we are going to bind this checkbox to. So we're going to use property feature dot swimming pool. Okay, and then here we need to set the render component, and inside it we're going to pass a callback that takes this object as its parameter. So we're going to extract the fields here from the parameter, and then we're going to render the checkbox here. So I just cut the checkbox here and paste it here. So I think we have a typo here. It's field, not the fields. And now here in the checkbox, we need to set the onChange event and onBlur events. So we're going to specify the onChange to field that onChange function, and then we're going to do the same with the onBlur field that onBlur. Okay, in this way we can actually get the value of the control input like checkbox with the React hook form. So let's copy that and paste it here. Again, let's copy this checkbox here and just paste it, and let's cut the label of this checkbox and paste it here. And also we need to change the name here. So this checkbox is going to be bound with the has swimming pool inside the property feature. Okay, so let's remove this checkbox and just copy this controller again. For the third checkbox, paste it here. First, let's cut the label of the checkbox, paste it here, and just change the name to property feature that has bulk name. Okay, and then we need to remove this checkbox. So in this way we can access to the value of the 3 checkboxes here in the property feature. Okay, we're done with the features component, and now let's do the same with the contact component. So I get back to the beginning of the component and just copy the use form context here and go to the contact, paste it here, and just import the missing imports. Okay, and then get back to the features component and just copy the code for binding each input. Get back to the contact and go to the first input, paste it here, and we just need to bind this input to contact.name. Just copy that here and paste it here. Okay, and then paste it here as well. So we need to put a question mark here and here after the contact. Just copy this code again, go for the next input, which is the phone, and put it here and just bind it with the contact.phone. Copy the phone and paste it here and here. Again, let's copy that and go for the next input. Okay, let's paste them here and bind them with the contact.email. Copy the email, paste it here instead of the phone, and we're done with the fourth step of our component. Except the picture component, we don't need to bind any input inside the picture. We are going to handle uploading the pictures separately outside the React hook form. So now let's go to the add property form here, and here we're going to set the onSubmit prop of the form element. So I'm going to set the onSubmit here and set it to methods.handleSubmit and then pass a onSubmit function. So we have an error here, and that's because we haven't created the onSubmit function. So now we're going to create it. Okay, so let's define the onSubmit function here. We're going to say const onSubmit and set its type to submit handler type, which comes from the React hook form. Then we need to specify the input type in the angle brackets. So we're going to pass the add property input type. Now we can set it to an async function, which takes the data, and then here we just log the data for now. Okay, let's save this, and now let's get back to the browser. So here, as you can see, if we go to the next section, you can see even the inputs are empty. We go to the next section. So we want to actually validate each part of the form when we click on the next. So in the next section, we are going to validate each part of the form upon clicking on the next button. In this section, we are going to enable the form validation on each part of the add property form. So first, we are going to do that in the basic part of the add property form. So I go to the VS Code and go to the basic component here. And let's close the Explorer here. And here, as you can see, we have a handle next function, which will be triggered when we click on the next button in the form. So here, as you can see, here in the next button, we have set the onClick event to the handle next function. So I get back to the handle next function, and here we need to put the form validation before calling the next function. It means that first we need to validate the form, and if it is successful, which means that there are no error on the form, then we can call the next function, which will take us to the next section of the add property form. So, and as you might know here in React hook form, when we call the submit handler of the form, it will automatically validate all the inputs of the form. But here we want to manually validate only the inputs that are on the basic component. So in order to do that, we need to extract the trigger function here from the use form context. Let's extract the trigger function, and here in the handle next function, we need to call the trigger function, which will actually validate the form And if there's not any error on the form, it will return true, and otherwise it will return false. So here first we need to put a block here on the handle next function, and then before calling the next function from the props, we need to call the trigger. So here we need to say await, because the trigger function is a async function, and then call the trigger function. And since we have used the await keyword here in the handle next function, we need to turn it to an async. So here I put the async here and the error is gone. So back to the trigger function, if we don't specify any field inside the trigger function, it will actually validate all the inputs in the form. So we don't want that here. We just want to validate the inputs that are on the basic part of the add property form. So here we need to pass a list here, and in that list we need to specify which input we are going to validate. As you can see here, the autocomplete will suggest the input that are on the form. So if we get back to the browser, we can see we have the name, description, type, status, and price. So here the first input we want to put the validation on is the name, and then we're going to add the description, also the type ID here, and status ID, and as the last one we're going to pass the price. Okay, so it will put the data validation only on these inputs here, and if there is no error here on these inputs, it will return true, otherwise return false. So we can put this function on a if statement. So we wrap it inside a if statement, and now actually if the returning value of the trigger function is true, the next function from the props will be called. Otherwise it won't call the next function. So now let's get back to the browser and test this data validation. And here if I click on the next, we still go to the next section even if we do not fill the inputs of the basic part. So here don't have any error. It means that we do not have any error on the basic part of the form. If I get back to the VS Code and go to the form schema, so here in the Z schema, we can see here we said that the Z should be a string, but we didn't specify the mean length of the string. So the trigger will validate the form and check if the, for example, name is a string or not. And then it will return true because name is a empty string and that doesn't raise any error. So here, for example, if on the name in the add property form schema, we chain a mean function, for example, and specify, for example, the mean length of the name should be 1, and then get back to the browser. Now if I click on the next, you can see we have an error on the name input, and it says that the string must contain at least 1 character. So we can also put a custom error message on the name input. So I get back to the Z schema here, and on the second argument of the main function, we can pass the custom message. So for example, we can say, please enter the name. So if I save that and get back to the browser, let's refresh the form. And if I click on the next, we have the error with the custom error message. And if I put a name here, for example, let's add some dummy data here. And if I click on the next, you can go to the next section because now the name property has at least 1 character inside it and it will not raise any error. So in this way, we can put some criteria on the fields of our schema in order to put a right data validation on the form. So let's get back to the form schema again. And here put some criteria on the other inputs of the basic fields. So for example, let's change the mean function again with the description. For example, let's say it is 2, and as the previous one, we can also pass the custom message, but to speed up the process, let's go ahead with the default error message. And then on the type ID here, before chaining the transform function, we need to chain the main function and set the mean length of the type ID to 1. And also let's put a custom message here, say select the type of your property. Okay, now let's do the same with the status ID here. After the string function, we're going to change the main function with the custom error message and say select the status of your property. And let's do the same with the price field. Put the main function and let's say enter the price. And you know what, let's put a custom message on the description as well. So here I'm going to say enter description. Okay, now let's get back to the browser, and if I click on the next, now we have the error with the custom messages on other inputs of the basic part of the form. So let's fill up the form here and choose the type and also status. And here on the price, let's put some number. And if I click on the next, you can see we can go to the next section. But here there is a problem with the price inputs. If I put some text inside the price, we can also go through the validation without any error. So we don't want that. We want to allow the user to put only numbers on the price field. So in order to do that, let's get back to the schema. And here on the price, we can add the regex function. So after the mean here in the price, we're going to change the regex function. And here inside the regex, we need to add a new regular expression. So here, say new and create a instance of the regexp class. And then inside it, we can pass a regular expression. So here we need to put a hat here. And inside it, we're going to say we are allowed to put some number from 0 to 9, and then we can add a plus, which means that at least one character from 0 to 9 should be existent in the field, and then put the $sign, which signifying the end of the regular expression. So let's save this, and after the regular expression, let's put the custom error message and say please enter number. Okay, let's save this and get back to the browser. If I click on the next here, you can see even if there is a data inside the price field, but we get the error, and the error message is please enter number. And here if I put some number here, click on the next, you can see we can go through the form validation. So yeah, in this way we can put the data validation on the basic part of the form. And now we are going to put the data validation on the location part of our form. So I get back to the VS Code, and here in the Zod schema, inside the location object, we need to put some validation criteria in each field of this object. So in the street address, we're going to change the mean function with the minimum length of 1, and then put a custom message here. We're going to say enter the street address. Let's copy this mean function and just put it here in this city, and we just need to change the custom message. So here I'm going to say enter the city name. Okay, let's do the same with the state. Just change the error message. Okay, let's go for the zip code, and here in the zip code we can change the mean function, but the better idea is to use refine function or put a regular expression. And here, since we have installed the validator package in our project, we can use the validator functions for validating the zip code. So here in the zip field, we're going to change the refine function, and then we need to pass a callback that takes the data of the zip code and say it is a validate zip code or not. So here we're going to use the validator here and pass the is postal code. So here I'm going to change the refine function and then pass the validator dot is postal code. So as you can see, it will give us an error, and that's because the refine function needs a callback that only takes the data as the string and returns a boolean. But this is postal code takes two arguments. It actually takes the data and also takes a second argument which specifies the region of the zip code. So we can't just pass the is postal code as the callback here. Okay, so in order to fix that, we need to manually call the is postal code inside the refine function. So we're going to put a callback here that takes the data, and then inside the callback, we're going to call the validator dot is postal code and then pass the data here. And as the second argument, we need to specify the locale. So here, as you can see, the list of the local that we can pass as the zip code. So here, let's just go with the CA, which is for Canada, and as the second argument, argument, we can pass the custom error message. So here we're going to say enter the zip code. Okay, and then go to the region, and then just as the previous fields here, we can use the main function. So I just copy that and paste it here and just change the error message. Let's set it to enter the region. Okay, and then let's leave the landmark as the optional field. So let's save this. Now we can go to the location component of the add property form. So here I'm going to go to the location, and then here in the use form context of the location component, we're going to extract the trigger function. And then here in the handle next function, we're going to use the trigger function to validate the location fields of the add property form. So let's put a block here, and then just put an async keyword here because the trigger function is a async function. And then put a if statement here and call the trigger here, and then pass the list of the field that we want to put the validation on them. Okay, we're going to pass the location.street address, and then location.city, location.state, and location.zip, and as the last one we're going to pass the location.region. Okay, so since the landmark is an optional field, we don't need to pass it here in the trigger function. Let's save this. So if the trigger function returns true here, it means that there is no error on the location part of the add property form, and then it will call the next function of the props. So let's get back to the browser, and here in the location, if we click on the next, we have the errors on the form. We're going to fix them. Let's put some dummy data here. Okay, and here also on the zip code. So if I click on the next, you can see we still have an error on the zip code because we have used the validator.isPostal function, which checks the postal code for us. So we need to put a zip code with a correct pattern. I don't know, something like this. It is a dummy code, and if I click on the next, you can see we can go through the form validation. Okay, so in the next section we are going to put the data validation on the feature section of the add property form. Okay, so I go back to the VS Code, and here in the Zot schema, we need to put the validation criteria on the fields of the property feature. So since these fields are number fields, we can go to the basic part and just copy the regex function here that we have put for the price field. So I get back to the bedrooms here and just paste it here in the bedrooms. We're going to change the error message here, number of the bedrooms. Okay, and here we need to remove one of the dots here and save this. So let's just copy that and go to the bathrooms field and paste it here and just fix the error message. Let's save this again. Let's just copy that, go to the parking spot, and after the string, let's just paste it and fix the error message here to please enter number of the parking spots. Okay, just copy that, and lastly go to the area field and paste it here and say please enter the area. Okay, let's save this, and we don't want to put any criteria on these three boolean fields. I save this and I go to the feature component of the add property form, and here in the form context, first we need to extract the trigger just as before, and in the handle next function we're going to say if then await, call the trigger and pass the list of the fields in the property feature. So I'm going to say property feature dot area, property feature dot bathrooms, property feature dot bedrooms, and property feature dot parking spots. Okay, let's save this and go to the browser, and if I click on the next, you can see we have the error messages. Let's put some data here, here, and here. If I click on the next, we can go to the next one and pass the data validation. So let's get back here and let's just put some text data on the area, and if I click on the next, you can see we have an error here, and that's because we have to put a number here. So let's change that to a number and click on the next. You can see we can pass through the validation. Let's get back to the VS Code and go to the Zot schema. Here, as you can see, we didn't change the mean function here. We just changed the regex function, and that's because in the regex, we expect at least one digit. So this plus here means that at least one of these characters must be in the field. If we put a star here instead of this plus sign, then it allows the empty string as the data of this field. So if we put the star here, we need to change the mean function function, but the better idea is to just put a plus here, which will guarantee that at least one character must be in the data field, so we don't need to change the main function. So that was a tip here for the regular expressions. And let's get back to the browser. The next part is the pictures form, and we don't want the validation here. And the last one is the contact form, which, as I said, is the last step of our multi-step form. And here we don't need to call the trigger function, because in this step of the form, we are going to submit the form with this save button, and submitting the form with the React hook form will automatically validate all the fields inside the form. So we don't need to call the trigger here. So we just need to put the validation criteria on the contact object of the Zod schema. So let's go to the VS Code and go to the form schema. Here inside the contact object of this schema, you can see we have already changed the refine function with the phone field and passed the validator.isMobilePhone, which guarantees that this field must have a valid phone number. And also in the email field, we have changed the email function, which guarantees that the data inside the email field must follow the pattern of a valid email. So we just need to change the main function for the name here. I put the main function here with the minimum length of 1 and a custom error message. So as I said, since the contact step is the last step of our multi-step add property form, we don't need to use the trigger function inside the contact. We just need to go to the add property form, our main form, and just set the onSubmit function of the form with the handle submit of the React hook form. It will automatically trigger the form validation for all the fields inside the form, including the inputs on the contact step. So we don't need to use trigger inside the contact to separately validate the data inside the contact step. So as you can see, we have already set the onSubmit function of the add property form to the handle submit function of the React hook form and pass the onSubmit function. So here inside the onSubmit function, you can see we can get the data of the form, and for now we have just consoled the data. So let's go back to the browser. Here we are inside the contact step, and if I click on the save, you can see we have the errors inside the contact step. So let's put some dummy data here again and put an email. Okay. And if I click on the save and open up the console, we don't have any data here, and that's because we have some error on the form. So let's get back here to the previous step, and as you can see, we don't have any error on the form. Okay, let's again click on the save, and we don't get the data inside the console. So there must be a error on the form, and in order to find that, here in the onSubmit function of the form, when we are passing the handle submit function of the React hook form and then pass the onSubmit function, which is this function, to it as the callback, we can also add another callback that will be called when an error is on the form. So here we're going to pass the callback, which is the submit error handler. It gets the error, so we just pass the errors, and then inside the callback, let's just log the error. Okay, so as you can see, it gets the error as its parameter, and then it will log the error on the console. So if we don't have any error on the validation of the form, this callback function will be called, and if the validation has failed, the second callback will be called. So let's save this and get back to the browser, and let's again put some dummy data here, put the zip code, and here fill up the features inputs and check all of these checkboxes. And here in the contact, we also need to fill up the fields. Let's clear up the console and click on the save. And yeah, you can see we have the errors object here. And if I open it, it's on the contact. You can see we need to put a valid phone number. Okay. So let's clear this up again and click on the save. Again, we have the error object, and the error is on the property feature, and it's on the has gotten yard, and it is required. So let's get back to the features. We have checked the has gotten yard, so there should be an error on the feature step of the add property form. So I get to the features and I get to the checkboxes here. The first one is for has swimming pool, and we have correctly set the name. The second one is for the garden. And yeah, this is the error that caused the problem. You can see this is for the garden, but we also set its name to has swimming pool. So let's set it to has garden yard and save this. And now let's get back to the browser and let's clear the console. Go to the next, and click on the save. And yeah, we don't have any error. Instead, we get the data which comes from the onSubmit function. And here you can see we have access to the data object, which contains the data of the all inputs of the entire form. Awesome. That's it for the form validation of the add property form. And in the next section, we are going to write a server action for inserting these data into our database. In this section, we are going to insert the property into our database. So there's a couple of things that we need to do here. So in order for you to understand this procedure better, I'm going to show you what we are going to do here in a sequence diagram. So inside our diagram tool, I have created a sequence diagram. So let's create a title for this diagram. And then we are going to have a add property page inside this sequence diagram, which is our entry point. Then we're going to have the Superbase client. So let's change the icon to a cloud. Okay. And then let's change the color to, for example, green. And after the Superbase client, we're going to have a server action. And after that, we're going to have the Prisma client in the next layer. Okay. And after that, in the bottom layer of our sequence diagram, we're going to have the database node. So you can see here, we have these 5 nodes in our sequence diagram. So in the first place, inside the add property page, first we are going to upload the images into the Superbase client. So after submitting the form, add property page request to the Superbase client, okay, and upload images into it. So here, for example, we're going to create and call a upload images function, and this will call the Superbase client and upload the images into it. After that, the Superbase client will get back the URLs of the uploaded images to the add property page. So here we're going to have an arrow here from the Superbase client to add property page. And for example, we're going to say get images URLs. So after getting the images URL, now we are going to call the server action from our server.ts file. So here add property page will request to the server action. For example, I'm going to say call server action, and then server action will use the Prisma client to insert the data. So server action here will use the Prisma client API and call the create function. And then after calling the create function, the Prisma client will issue an insert statement to our database. So here we're going to create an arrow from the Prisma client to our database, and for example, say insert statement. Okay, so this is the step that we are going to take in order to insert a new property into our database. First, we are going to upload the images into the Superbase client and get back the images URLs, and then call the server action add property server action actually, and pass the property data into it as well as the URLs of the images that we've got from the Superbase client. And inside the server action, we're going to use the Prisma client and call the create function, and the Prisma client under the hood issues an insert statement into our database. So with that in mind, let's get back to our VS Code and start implementing this sequence diagram. First, we need to upload the images into the Superbase client. In the first step, we need to go to the Superbase, since in this project we upload the images into this platform. So here, let's go to the dashboard. Let's choose the project that we have created in the previous section of this tutorial. Okay, and then go to the storage section here from the left panel side. Here, as you can see, we have already created a avatar bucket for uploading the profile pictures of the user. So now we are going to create a new one. I'm going to create new buckets here. I'm going to name it property images, and then we are going to set it as a public bucket. Let's click on the save here, and we're done in the Superbase section. So let's get back to the VS Code, and then I go to the upload.ts file, which is in the lib directory. In this file, we have already created a upload avatar, which takes the image and then upload it to the avatar buckets of our Superbase project. So I'm going to create another function here. First, I'm going to export it. I'm going to say export async function, and I'm going to name it upload images, and then it takes the list of images, and let's set its type to a list of files. Okay, and here let's just copy the 3 lines of code of the upload avatar for creating a supervised client, and then go to the upload images and paste them here. Okay, and then here we are going to upload the images that we've got here in the parameters to the property images bucket of the supervised. So I'm going to say const data and set it to await, and call the promise.all function, since we are going to upload all the images simultaneously with the supervised. It is much faster than the serial approach of the uploading files one by one. So inside the promise.all, we're going to loop through the images. So I'm going to say images.map, and here get the file, and for each file inside the images, we are going to call the superbase client.storage.from, pass the bucket name, which is the property images, and then call the upload function and specify the file name inside the superbase bucket for each file. So here I'm going to put the file name, file.name, and then pass the date.now, which this combination of the date and the file name guarantees that we don't have any duplicated name on our property images bucket on the superbase. And then after the file name, we need to pass our file itself. So I just put the file here. Okay, so let's save this and close the Explorer here. You can see we use the promise.all and then just call the upload function of the supervised storage. It is a async function. So since we use it inside the promise.all, we don't need to await for it. We just create all promises for all the files inside the images list and then await for them simultaneously. Okay, and then after resolving the all promises, we are going to extract the URL of the uploaded images. So here I'm going to say const URLs and then map through the data.map, and then get the file here. For each file, I'm going to say superbase.storage.from, then pass the bucket name, which is the property images, and then here from that we are going to call the get public URL and then pass the file data. So let's just rename this file to an item, because this is not a file. This is the returning data that we've got from the upload function. So it is not appropriate to just rename it to file. It's a item, and then pass the data and then dot path, and then from returning object of the get public URL, we are going to grab the data and then public URL. So finally, the URLs list here is the list of the public URLs of the uploaded images on the superbase. So since this might be undefined, we are going to put a double question mark here and just pass the empty string in case of the data.path was not available. Let's save this. Okay, and then we just need to return the URLs list. So I'm going to say return URLs. So this upload images first takes the list of the images, create superbase client, upload the images on the superbase, and then returns the public URL of each image in a list called URLs. That's it. So now we can go to the add property form and call the upload images function. So let's go to the add property form here and go to the onSubmit function. And here I'm going to call the upload images function. So here I'm going to say const image URLs and set it to await upload images function, and just pass the images list, which is a state that contains the images that the user choose to upload on the picture step of the add property form. Okay, so let's save this and let's just log the images URL here and get back to the browser. Put some dummy data here, also fill up this section of the form, and here let's upload this file and also this file. Click on the next, fill up this section. Okay, so let's open up the console, and if I click on the save here, we got the data, and then after that we've got the images URL. So if I open up the images URL, you can see that we have the public URL of the uploaded image. So now let's get back to the Supabase and open up the property images bucket. And here let's reload it. You can see now we have two images here. This is the first one and this is the second one. So our upload images function works correctly. In the next section, we are going to write the server action for inserting the property into our database. So now let's write the server action for inserting the new property into our database. So here I go to the lib directory, and then inside the lib directory, I've already created an actions directory. And inside the actions directory, as you might remember, we write our server actions. So here let's create another file. I'm going to call it property.ts, and inside this file we are going to write the server actions relating to the properties. So here let's create a function for saving the property into our database. So I'm going to say export async function, and I'm going to call it save property. And then this save property takes 3 arguments. The first one is the data that we've got from the add property form. So I'm going to call it property data and set its type to add property input type that we've inferred from the schema. Okay, so let's close the Explorer to have more room here. And then in the second argument, we need the images URLs that we are going to upload on the Supabase. So here I'm going to say images URLs, which is going to be a list of string. And on the second argument, we need to specify this property belongs to which user. So we need the user ID of the creator of this property. So it is going to be a string. Okay, so now let's write the body of this save property server action. So since this is going to be a server action, let's mark this file with use server directive. So here I'm going to say use server. So every function in this file now is a server action. So now let's go back to the body of the save property here. We have 3 parameters: property data, image URLs, and the user ID. So here I'm going to call the create function of the Prisma to insert the property into our database. So here I'm going to say await, and then call Prisma, import Prisma from the Prisma global file, and then property, and from property we're going to call the create function. So in this function we need to pass the data that we are going to create in our database. So first let's set the returning object of this create function to a result object. Let's say const result, and then here inside this function we're going to pass a configuration object, and inside it we need to specify the data. And here in the data we need to pass the property data based on the schema of our database. So if I go back to the database diagram, you can see we have a property table which takes the user ID, name, description, price, type ID, and status ID. And then here we have a separate table for the feature, also separate table for the property images, contact as well, and also we have a separate table for the property location. So we need to save the data based on these tables and their relationship with each other. So first we need to extract the property data that needs to be inserted in the property table from the property data parameter of the save property server action, this property data. So first, before calling the create function, let's extract the basic data of the property. So here I'm going to create a basic object. I'm going to call it basic, and let's set its type to property that we've got from the Prisma client, and then let's initialize it. So we have the name here. We are going to set it to property data.name. Then we're going to have description. I'm going to set it to property data.description. Then we're going to have the price. We are going to set it to property data.price. We're going to have the status ID, which is going to be property data.status ID. Okay. We're going to have type ID. We're going to set it to property data.type ID. And lastly, we need to specify the user ID. Okay. So here in the basic object, which its type is property, we have an error. And that's because the property type has an ID and we didn't initialize the ID of the property. But since the ID inside our table is a auto increment primary key, we should not initialize the ID. So in order to get rid of this error here, we need to delete the ID from this property type here. So we're going to use a utility type of the TypeScript, which is omit, and then in the angle brackets, we're going to pass the property, and then in the second generic, we are going to say that we want to delete the ID from the property type, and then close the angle bracket, and as you can see, the error is gone. So with this omit utility type, we are going to remove the ID from the property type. And then here in the data, we can spread the basic object here, okay? And then if I go back to the database schema here, we need to insert a new record into the property location, which describes the fields of the property location. So here inside the data, we can specify the location, and then here inside the location, we're going to use the create API. Okay, so in this way, we are saying that we want to create a new record into the location model as well. So we're going to set the create API to property data dot location. Okay, and we have an error here. So if I hover on that, it says that property street address is missing in the type. So we have a typo here. And so let's open up the location. It doesn't have the typo here. So we need to go to the Prisma schema, and here in the location model, we need to find the street address. You can see here we have a typo here. It is set to street. So let's fix that street address. Then we are going to run a migration. So I'm going to say npx prisma migrate dev, then dash name, and for example, say fixing typo. Let's run the migration. Okay, now let's get back to the property.ts file and the save property saver action. You can see since the typo has been fixed, the error is gone. So now let's get back to the database schema here. We need to insert a new record to the property feature as well. You can see the relationship between the property feature and the property table is 1-to-1. So we need to just create one property feature in our database. So let's get back to the save property saver action, and then here after the location, we're going to specify the feature here, and then here again, since we are going to create a new feature here, we need to use the create API here, data that property feature. Okay, then let's get back to the database schema. We need to create a new record also in the contact table. So let's get back to the save property saver action, and then after the feature, let's specify the contact, and then here again we are going to create one record. So I use the create API and then pass the property data that contact. And let's get back to the schema here. Lastly, we need to add multiple records to the property image, because the relationship between the property and property image is 1-to-many. So for each property record, we might have multiple property images. So let's get back to the VS Code. And here, as you can see, we have a list of images URL, which we need to insert them into the property image table. So here, let's specify the images in the create function. And then here, we're going to specify the create API. But here we can't just plainly pass the images URL. We need to pass a list of objects that each object has to have a URL field. So let's get back to the schema here. You can see the ID is the primary key. We don't need to set that. And also we have the property ID, which is the foreign key of the table. Also, we don't need to set that. The Prisma and create API will set that for us. We just need to specify the URL. Okay, so for the create API here, we need to pass a list of objects that each object inside it has a URL property. So here we're going to map through the images path and then return a new array that contains a list of objects that each one has URL inside it. So here I'm going to say images URLs that map, and then get the img here, and then for each img we're going to return a object. So let's put a parenthesis here, then inside the parenthesis let's return an object, and this object should have a URL inside it, and the URL is going to be the img, because each members of the images URLs list is actually the URL of the uploaded image. Okay, so let's save this. In this way we can insert a relatively complex object into our database with Prisma. First, we have passed the basic data to the property table, and then for the location, create a new record inside the location object with the property data.location and connect it, and then the Prisma will connect it to the property record. Okay, we don't need to worry about that. The Prisma will do that for us. We do the same with the feature and contact, And for the image, since it has a one-to-many relationship with the property table, we need to pass a list of object that contains the URL inside them. Okay, so as the last step, first let's log the result here. So I use the console.log and pass the results inside it, and then we can just return the result. Okay, so we're done with the save property server action, and then we need to go back to the add property form, and here in the onSubmit function, after the uploading the images, we need to call the save property server action. So here I'm going to use a try catch block, and here I'm going to call the server action save property, pass the add property data which we are getting from the inputs of the form. So just pass the data here, and in the second argument we need to pass the images URL. Okay, so I pass the image URLs here, and as the third argument here we need to pass the current user ID. So first we need to get the user from the kind of, so get back to the beginning of the component, and here we're going to call the use kind browser client, and from the returning object we're going to get the user. So here I'm going to say const and then grab the user from the returning object. So in this way we can access to the current signed in user. So get back to the onSubmit function. After passing the images URL as the third argument here, we need to pass the user the ID. Okay, and since this is a protected page, only the signed in user can access to this page. So we can make sure that the user is always available in this function. So I put a exclamation mark here to assert that this is not going to be undefined. So after that we need to show something like a toast that has a message inside it, and say for example the property has been saved in the database. We're going to do that in a second, but before doing that, let's redirect the user to the user.properties route. So here we can use the redirect function from next/navigation and then pass the /user and then /properties. And then after the try, we need to pass the catch block, get the error, and then for example, let's console.error, pass the error inside it. Okay, let's rename it to error here, and here let's rename it to error as well. So if there is a error for inserting the new user, we can just log it into the console. Okay, so now let's install a toast component in our project and then show the toast here after saving the user in our database. Okay, now let's install the React-Toastify. So you just need to search for the React-Toastify, and here inside the npmjs.com you can find it. Go to the installation section and just copy the script for installing that. Get back to our project and open up the terminal. Just paste it here to install the React-Toastify. Okay, and then get back to the browser, and here we need to render a toast container in the entry point of our application. So the example here is for a React project, but we are using the Next.js project. So let's just copy that, and we need to paste it in the root layout of our application. So I get back to the VS Code and go to the app directory, and let's close off all these directories here, and here's our root layout. Then here after the children we're going to render the toast container. So let's import that from the React-Toastify. Okay, and then we just need to go back to the add property form here, and after save property server action we need to create a toast. So I just say toast.success, and we can pass a proper message here. For example, property added. Okay, let's save this. Now we can go ahead and test our application. So I get back to the browser and I go back to our application, and we have an error here in the property.ts file, our server action file. I think we just misspelled the use server directive. So get back to the VS Code, and here, oh, I said user server. We should say use server. Okay, let's save that and get back to the browser. We have on the add property page, and here let's just add a new property. So I just install a extension from my Chrome that fills the inputs of the form with dummy data automatically. So as you can see, it fills up the form. Go to the next step, again fill the inputs, next, and here let's put some number in the numbers here, and here check all these three text boxes. Okay, upload some images, this, and let's add this one. Next, fills the inputs here. And if I click on the save here, so we need to add a valid phone number. It's just for validator object. Okay, let's click on the save here. So as you can see, the toast has shown in a really awkward way, and you can see the property added text here in this form. So I think we should have imported a CSS file for the React-Toastify. So let's open up again the React-Toastify documentation in the npmjs.com. As you can see here, we have forgotten to import the React-Toastify CSS in our root layout. So let's just copy that and go to the VS Code, and let's go to the root layout of our application. Okay, here in the root layout, let's just import the React-Toastify CSS file. Let's save that. Let's go back to the browser, and you can see the property added toast in the add property page. So now we need to go to the Prisma Studio to check the inserted data. Get back to VS Code, open up the terminal, and here I'm going to say npx Prisma Studio. Okay, go to the property model. You can see our added property is now on the database. Let's little zoom in. Okay, you can see that the user here, it's me, and you can see the property type, which has been set to condo, and the property status which has been set to for sale. Okay, you can see the property location. As you can see, it has a one-to-one relationship with the property location. So you can see there is one record related to property in the property location model with its data. And let's go to the feature again. You can see the data of the property feature. This is also a one-to-one relationship, so you can see that there is just one record for the property in the property feature model. And lastly, as you can see, we have two images in the property image model for this property. So it means that this is a one-to-many relationship from property to property images. Okay, you can see the contact here, and again, this is a one-to-one relationship. So yeah, that's it for save property, server action, and also add property form. We have created a 5 steps add property form and integrated with React hook form, get the data and validate the data with Zod resolver, and then save the data inside our database with the help of the Prisma and the power of the server actions in the Next.js. Now we can go to the next section of this tutorial. In this section, we are going to complete this page, user properties page. So after user, add a new property, the property must be shown here in this page, just like this. So in this section, we are going to focus on this page, and in the upcoming section, we are going to add more functionalities like showing the details of the property, edit the property, and also delete the property. So now let's focus on the user properties page itself. In order to have a page just like this, we need to do it in 3 steps. First, we are going to retrieve the data from the database. Then we are going to create this table. And finally, we are going to add pagination functionality to this page. So now let's get back to VS Code and implement the functionality for retrieving the user properties from our database. So here I go to the user properties page inside the app directory, and then the user directory, I go to the properties page. So let's close the add property here. We don't want that. We're going to focus on the page.tsx inside the /user/properties. So here's the properties page. Here in the first step, we need to retrieve the data, which are user properties, from our database. So we're going to do that with the help of the Prisma. And one thing you should note here is that this page only retrieves the properties of the current signed in user. Okay, so first we need to know which user is now signed in. We can do that with the kind API. This is a server component, and we can access to the current user with the get kind server session. So here, let's first convert this component to an async component. So let's put a async here, and then here let's call the get kind server session. So I'm going to use await and then get kind server session. Okay, so again here we need to import the get kind server session directly from the kind OS's kind of Next.js and then /server. Okay, so you need to fix the import here. then we don't need to pass anything to it. And from the returning object, we can grab the get user function. So here I'm gonna say const, and then we can grab the get user function, okay? And in the next step, we can access to the current user with the get user function. So I'm gonna say const user and set it to await get user. So in this way, in a server component, we can access to the current signed in user with the kind of, okay? Let's save this. And now that we have the current user, we can retrieve the properties of this user from our database with Prisma. So here we can call the find many function of the Prisma. I'm going to say await Prisma.property find many, and then we need to pass the configuration object. Here inside that, we need to specify the where API, which property we want. I'm going to say find the properties with their user ID is equal to user.id, okay? And if I go to the database diagram here, you can see we have the property, but we have the property type and property status on a separate tables. So if I get to the final version of the user properties, so note that this is the final version, you can see that we have type and status for each property. So we need to retrieve the type and status of the property. And here, as you can see, they are in the separate tables. So get back to VS Code. Here after the where API, we can use the include API of the find many function. And inside it, we can set the type to true. This will also retrieve the related type for the property, okay? And also we need to set the status to true. So in this way, we not only retrieve the property from the property table, but also we retrieve the related property type and related property status from these two tables in the same query. Okay, so get back to VS Code. This is our find many function. So this find many function returns a list of user properties. As you can see, we have used the await keyword and wait for this function to be resolved. But since later in this section, we are going to add the pagination property, we need to know the total number of the user properties. So we need to write one more query. We are going to have two queries. It is better to use promise.all to wait for these two queries to be resolved in the same time. So I remove this await keyword here and just keep it as a promise. Okay, so I'm going to set it to properties promise. It's a promise now. Then here, after the find many function, we're going to put it inside a promise.all. Okay, so I'm going to say const and create a list here, and then set this list to await and call the promise.all, and then pass a list here inside it, which is the list of the promises that we are going to wait for them to be resolved simultaneously. For now, we have just one promise, which is the properties promise. So I put it here, properties promise. Later, we are going to put another promise for retrieving the total number of the user properties here. But for now, it's just one, okay? And then here we can access to the list of the properties here. So here, I'm going to call the final list of the retrieved properties to just properties. So now let's just log the properties here. So I'm going to use the console.log here and put the properties object here. Let's save this and let's run our project. Go to the users properties here. Okay, this is our user properties, and let's get back to the VS Code. And here, as you can see, let's extend up the terminal. You can see we have the list of the properties inside our terminal. Okay, so in this way, we can access to the list of the user properties correctly without any error. So now we can move to the next subsection, which is creating this table for our user properties page. Okay, let's get back to the VS Code, and here inside the properties directory, I'm going to create a new directory called components or underscore components. I put in underscore here because I want it to be placed on the first place in the properties directory. So it's just for that. And then here, I'm going to create a properties table.tsx inside it. Okay, let's create a component here. Now let's create a type for the props of the component. So here I'm going to say type, and you can do this with the interface, but for now let's just do that with the type keyword. Okay, so I'm going to say props, and it is going to be an object. It should have the properties inside it, and then set its type to property, which comes from the Prisma client, and then we're going to have a list of them. But here there is a problem. if I hover on the property, you can see it has ID, name, description, price, user ID, type ID, and status ID. But if I go to the final version of the properties table, you can see we need the name of the type and also name of the status for each record of this table. Okay, so let's get back to the VS Code. We should include the status model and type model inside this property type. It was really easy with the Prisma, so I just use the Prisma with the uppercase P. Don't confuse it with the Prisma client that we have created in the Prisma.ts file. We're going to import the Prisma class with the uppercase P from the @prisma/client, okay? And then we're going to use the property get payload type, and then in the generics we can pass an object, okay? And then inside it we can use the include API, and here inside the include we can set the type to true and also status to true. Okay, so now if I hover on the properties, you can see the type has a status object inside it with the ID and value, and also a type with its ID and value, and then it has the basic information about the property. This is what we need in the properties prop of this component. And then as a last step, we need to say that we need a list of them. Okay, so we need a list of this crafted class here. Now we can access to the properties. So I use the object extraction here to extract the properties from the props. Let's first set its type to props type that we have just created, and then we can access to the properties and extract it from the props of the component. Okay, then inside it we need to render a table, and inside that table we're going to render the data inside the properties list. So I use the table component from the Next UI, a table. You can see it comes from the Next UI/React, and then inside it we're going to have a table header. You can do that with a basic HTML table as well. So I'm going to say table header. Let's import that, and inside it we're going to have our table columns. The first column is going to be name. Okay, we have an error here, and that's because we need to add a table body. So first, before adding the other columns here, let's add a table body, and that will actually fix the problem for us. So let's copy this table column and paste it here. The second column is going to be the price. Okay, let's paste another one, and it is going to be type. Let's have another one. It is going to be status, and let's add the last one, which is going to be actions. Okay, let's save that, and now we are going to add the table records inside the table body. So we need to loop through the properties and then add a table row for each property. So here inside it, I'm going to say properties.map. Note that this properties comes from the props, and then we're going to have the item here, and then for each item we're going to have a table row. Okay, and then inside this table row we need to add our table cells. So let's add one table cells here. Okay, table cell, and then let's import that. Okay, and then inside this table cell we're going to render the item.name. Okay, let's copy that and paste it here as a second table cell. The second column is the price, so we're going to render the item.price. The third one is going to be type, so here we're going to say item.type.value. Okay, so the value is actually the text or the title or the name of the type of the component. Let's have another one. It is going to be status, so I'm going to say item.status.value. And for the last one, let's go to the final version. We need to have these three buttons, one for the detail, one for the edit property, and the other for the delete property. Okay, so we need to render a div inside the last table cell. So let's first copy that. Okay, inside it we're going to render a div here. Inside the div, first we are going to render the details button. So it's just a link component from the Next.js. I'm going to add a link, and make sure that your link comes from the next/link. Okay, and then for the link we need to pass the href. It's going to be /property and pass the ID of the property. So let's put the item.id. Okay, in the upcoming section we're going to add this page with this route /property, and then create a dynamic route inside it in which we can render each property in details. Okay, now inside the link caption we're going to render a eye icon. So here I'm going to use eye icon from the hero icons, and we just need to set the class name to just w5 for its width. Okay, let's save this, and we have have an error here, and that's because we somehow removed the curly braces that starts here. Okay, let's save this, and we have created the first button. But before adding the other two buttons, let's test this property table. So I get back to the properties page, and here instead of this dummy div here, let's render the properties table. So I render the properties table component that we have created in the underscore components of this directory. Okay, we need to specify the properties prop. So I set it to properties that we've got from the promise.all. Okay, now let's go back to the browser. We have an error here, and I think that's because since we have used the table component from the Next UI, we need to mark it with the use client. So I mark it with the use client and get back to the browser. Now you can see we don't have any error here. So we have 3 property for the user, and here we have the actions column. So if I get back to the final version, you can see we have the tooltip for each of these buttons here. So we can use the tooltip component of the Next UI here. I get back to the properties table, and here inside the action cell, we're going to wrap this link with a tooltip component. So here, let's use the tooltip here, comes from the Next UI. Okay, and then wrap the link component in this tooltip. Okay, let's save this, and here inside the tooltip, we need to set the content props, which actually is the text of the tooltip. So it is going to be details. Get back to the browser, and here if I hover on the button, you can see the tooltip here, but actually it doesn't show up right above the button. So we're going to fix that in a second. Let's add the other buttons, but before doing that, here we just need to add some class name in the eye icon. We're going to use the text slate 500 for its color, and we're going to have the cursor. Okay, and then add the second button, which is for editing the property. So let's change the content here, say edit property. We can also set the color of the tooltip. We're going to set it to warning, and it will be a yellow colored background. And then here inside the link, we need to set the href to /user/properties, and then item.id, and after that /edit. Okay, and then here we need to change the icon. We're going to use the pencil icon, and here we just need to change the color to text yellow 500. Okay, let's copy this tooltip and the link and paste it for the last button. It is going to be the delete property. So I change the content of the tooltip and set its color to danger. Okay, and we also need to change the href of the link. Instead of edit, we need to add the delete. Note that we haven't created these pages, but we will create them in the upcoming sections. And then here, instead of the pencil icon, we're going to use the trash icon and just change the name to text red 500. Okay, get back to the VS Code. Here, as you can see, the actions are not side by side. So we need to use flex property in the parent div of these actions. Set the class name of the parent div to flex and item center, and also put a gap of 4 between them. Let's get back to the browser. Now we have the actions side by side, and if I hover on the buttons, you can see the position of the tooltip is right above the buttons, and the previous error is fixed. Okay, so here we're done with this subsection. In the upcoming section, we are going to create 3 pages. One for the details of the property, the second is going to be the edit property, and the third one is going to be delete property. But before doing that, we need to implement the pagination here for this user properties page. In order to add the pagination, we need more properties for this user. So I pause the video and add some more properties in the properties table, and then we can go back and start implementing the pagination functionality for this user properties table. Okay, I have inserted a bunch of properties in the properties table, and you can see we have a lot of the properties in the user properties page. So we need to implement the pagination functionality to paginate these properties. So in order to do that, I get back to VS Code, and here in the properties table component, after the table, we are going to add a pagination component from the Next UI. Okay, so I'm going to add a pagination from the Next UI, and then we need to set a couple of props here. The first one is going to be total, which is the total of the pages. For now, let's add a hard-coded data, for example 10. The initial page is going to be 1. We need to calculate the total number of the pages from the total number of the user properties inside the properties table. So for now, let's save this and get back to the browser. Now you can see we have a pagination component here, which has 10 pages, and we can change the current page. So let's put it on the center of the page, get back to VS Code, and here in the parent div of this component, let's set the class names. First, we're going to set it to flex and flex cool for the flex direction. And for putting the items on the center of the page, we're going to use the item center. Okay. And let's add a gap for the space between the table and the pagination components. Let's get back to the browser. Now you can see it's much better and it's now on the center of the page. Okay. Now we need to go back to the user properties page. And here, when we are retrieving the user properties, we need to also retrieve the total number of the user property. So before this promise.all, we are going to make another query to our database. Okay, we're going to say const and we're going to call it total properties promise, because we are not going to resolve this promise right here. We're going to resolve it in the promise.all function. So we just call it total properties promise. It's just name of the promise and it really doesn't matter. Okay, so we're going to set it to prisma.property.count. Okay, so here before passing the configuration object to the count function, note that here we don't use the await keyword because, as I said, we are going to resolve this promise in the promise.all. So make sure that you don't use the await here. I'm going to use the configuration object into the count function, and here we are going to count the number of records inside our property table. So I just put the where API user ID of the property equals to our current user the ID. Okay, so it actually counts the number of records inside the property table, which their user ID equals to the current user.id. And then here, after the properties promise inside the promise.all function, we're going to pass the total properties promise. So we are actually resolving two queries in the same time. That's why we use the promise.all in the previous section here. So we don't need to change our code now. And then here in the returning array, we're going to get the total properties. Okay, so this is the resolved number of the total properties. Let's save that, and now we can calculate the number of the total pages of our pagination system. Before doing that, we need to decide about the page size. So here, outside of the component, we're going to define a constant for the page size. So I'm going to say const page size, and for example, set it to 12. Okay, and then get back here after the promise.all function, we can calculate the total number of the pages. So I'm going to say const total pages and set it to math.floor, and then pass the total properties divided by the page size constant. So this will be our total pages in the user properties page. And now here, when we are actually retrieving the user properties, we don't want to retrieve all the properties in just one query. We are going to define actually a state here, page nom, and based on the page nom, we are going to retrieve only the properties that are in the page nom branch. For example, if the page nom is 1, we just retrieve the first 12 properties since we have set the page size to 12. And if the page nom is 2, we are going to retrieve the second 12 properties from our database. It is really important to do that if you want to have a scalable application, because when the number of the properties is a huge number, it is not really a good idea to retrieve all the properties in just one query. So we need to split the properties in the pages and each time just retrieve one page of our data. So the page nom should be a state in this page. But how we can keep a state in a server component? We can't use state here because it's a server component. Well, one of the options that we have here, which is really good, is to use search params to keep the state of this page. What I mean here, if I go back to the browser and go to the final version of the application, you can see we have a search param with the page nom in the URL of our application. So here we keep the page nom, our state, in the URL of this page. So in order to do that, we need to use the search params in our server component page. So here, let's get back to the VS Code, and here we are in the user properties page. We need to define an interface for the props of this component. So here I'm going to say interface props, and then inside it we're going to have search params. It should be search params, so the name is really does matter here, and its type is going to be something like this. I have copied that from the Next.js documentation. It is a kind of dictionary or key value pairs that have key inside it, and the value should be a string or a list of string or undefined. And then we can have the search params in the props of this component. So here we're going to extract the search params from the props. First we need to set its type to the props interface that we have just created, and then we can access to the search params. And then here we can define the page num. I'm going to say const page num and then set it to search params page num. Okay, and if the page num doesn't exist in the page, we just set the page num to 0. Okay, so I use the double question mark here, and in case of the page num is undefined, we just set the 0 to page num. This is the way when we are going to use the search params in our pages in the Next.js app router. We need to define this interface with the search params inside it, and the type should be something like this, and then we can get the search params from the props of the component. That's it. So we have the page num here. How we can tell the Prisma to only retrieve the properties that are in the current page. Here in the find many function, we can specify 2 more parameters. After the include API here, we can define the skip, and we're going to set it to page num times page size. So for example, if the page num is 0, we actually don't skip any records inside a property table. But if the page num is 1, we're actually skipping the first 12 records of our property table, and then we can take any number of pages that we want. So here after the skip, we are going to specify the take parameter, which specifies the number of the records that we want to retrieve after skipping the pages based on the page num. So here we're going to pass the page size again. And here we have an error, and that's because the value of the page num is string. As you can see here, the value of the search params can be string, a list of string, or undefined. So in order to turn it to a number, we can just put a plus before it. Okay, so in this way we can retrieve our data based on the pagination system that we have defined in this page. We're not done yet. We need to pass the total pages and also the current page num to the properties table. And then here in the properties table, we need to get them from the props of the component and set them here in the pagination component. Okay, so first let's add these 2 parameters to the props type of the component. After the properties prop, we're going to specify the total pages and set its type to number, and also we're going to have the current page, which is going to be a number as well. Okay, now we can go to the pagination component, and here instead of these hard-coded total pages, we're going to render the total pages from the props of the component. So let's get back here and extract them from the props, total pages, and also the current page, and get back to the pagination component. We're going to set the total to total pages prop, and then we're going to leave the initial page to be 1, and we have another prop here, which is the page, which specify which page should be active here. So we're going to pass the current page, and then when actually we click on one of these pages, the page number should be changed. So here, as you can see in the final version, if we click on the 5 here, you can see the page is changed, and also the page num inside the URL is changed to 5. So in order to do that, I get back to VS Code, and here in the pagination we have a onChange event, and inside it we can pass a callback here. We're going to have the page parameter for the callback, which is actually the number of the page that the user has clicked on. Now we can access to the number of the page. We need to redirect the user to the same page, but this time the page num search params should be changed to this page parameter. So in order to redirect the user, we're going to use the use router hook. Since this is a client component, we're going to use the use router hook. So I say const router and equals to use router. You should import it from the next/navigation. It is really important. Okay, and then let's get back here to the pagination component, and here we can use the router, call the push function to the same page, which is the user/properties, and then put the search params page num, and then pass the page parameter of this callback. So let's turn them to a backtext here. And then here, we're going to say page num equals, and then pass the page itself. Okay, now let's get back to the page.tsx. And here now, since we have changed the properties table props type, we need to pass total pages and also the current page. So here, we're going to set the total pages to the total pages that we have calculated here. And then we're going to set the current page to the page num. Okay, and then since it's a string, we're going to put a plus before it to turn it to a boolean. Let's save this now. And if I get back to the browser, you can see now we have only retrieved the first 12 property. So if I click on the second page here, you can see now we have a page num search params on the URL, and now we have on the second page. Go to 3, now we have on the third page, and go to the last one, and you can see now we have on the last one. Awesome. That's it for the user properties page, and we have completed our 3 tasks in this page. And now in the next section, we are going to implement the property details page. So when we click on the details here, we are going to be redirected to the properties details page. Okay, in this section, we are going to create the property details page. So if I click on one of the property details here, you can see we are headed to the property and then slash the ID of the property. And of course, since we haven't created this route in our application, we are headed to a 404 page. So if I go to the final version of the application, if I click on the property details here, you can see we are headed to a page that renders the details about the property. And also we're going to have a image slider for the property images. So in this section, we're going to create this page. I get back to VS Code, and here inside the app directory, we're going to create another directory called property. And then inside it, we're going to create a dynamic route, which takes the ID as the params. And then inside it, we're going to have the page.tsx. Okay, so don't confuse this property directory here with the user/properties here. This is a separate directory. Here I'm going to create a component, and let's rename it to property page. Okay, and since this is a dynamic route, we need to have params inside the props of the component. So let's define interface for the props. I'm going to say interface props, and then inside it we're going to have the params object, and inside it we are going to have an ID param, and then set its type to string. Okay, so now we can access to the params here. First, we need to set the type of the props to the props interface that we have just created, and then we can extract the params out of it. Okay, now we need to retrieve the property based on the provided ID in the params. So here, I'm going to say const property, and then call the prisma.findUnique function. Since it's a async function, we need to set the component to an async component, and then we can call the findUnique function. So here I'm going to say await Prisma, our global Prisma client, that property, that findUnique function, and then pass the configuration object. And here we need to specify the where object, and inside it we're going to say that retrieve the property where its ID equals to params.id. And since the params.id is a string, we're going to put a plus before it to turn it to a string. And if I go to the database diagram of the application, you can see we have the property. Also, we have the property location, property feature, property image, contact, property type, status, and user related to the property type. So we need to retrieve the property as well as its related data inside the related table to the property table. So let's get back to the VS Code, and here in order to retrieve the data about the property in the related tables, we need to specify the include API here, and inside it we're going to set the status to true, feature. Also, we're going to do the same for the feature, location, contact, and also images. So in this way, we can retrieve the data about the retrieved property in these tables as well. So after retrieving the property, we need to check if the property is existed or not. And if it's not existed, we need to redirect the user to a 404 page. So here I'm going to say if not property, which means that the property is not existed, we're going to return not found. You can see it comes from the next/navigation. So it will redirect the user to to a 404 page. And then if the property is existed, we can render the property details page. Here inside this, the parent div, we need to render a page title, which as you can see comes from the components directory of the app directory. We have created this component in the previous episode of this tutorial. So here we're going to set the title to property page, okay, and then set the href to the home page and link caption to something like back to properties. Okay, so now let's get to the browser, and as you can see, instead of the 404 page, now we have a page with this page title. I get back to VS Code. After the page title, we're going to put a div here, and let's set a padding for this div. We're going to set the class name and set it to P4. Okay, it's for the padding of this div, and then inside it we are going to render a h2 for the property name. So inside it we are going to render the property name, property.name. Okay, let's get back to the browser. You can see now we have the property name here. Let's style the h2 elements. We're going to set the class name. First we set the text size to text 2XL, and then fonts bold, then text primary for the color, and for the margin of top and button we are going to set the MY5. Let's get back to the browser. Now we have the property name with those style. Now we're going to go to the final version. This is the final version. We are going to create a grid system with 3 grids here, 2 for the image slider and the other one for this info panel here. So let's get back to the VS Code, and after the h2 elements we are going to put another div, set the class name and set up the grid system. Grid equals 1 for the small sized screen, and for the LG and above screens we are going to put 3 columns on our grid system. So we're gonna add the grid equals 3 and then a pretty large gap, for example gap 10 for the width between the info panel and image slider. So inside the div, first we are going to create a image slider. So we're going to create another div and set its class name to coolspan2 because we are going to span it through 2 columns here. And for now, let's just first create the info panel, and then we're going to back here and create the image slider. So here I'm going to create a to do here, put image slider here. Okay, now after this div we are going to create the info panel. I'm talking about this panel here. So let's get back to the VS Code here. Now put a card component here, and inside this component first we are going to create 3 sections. The first one is for the features, the second is the address or location, and the third one is going to be for owner details. So in this step we are going to create a title component, and then for each of these attributes we are going to create an attribute component which are reusable, and then with this attribute component fills up the data here. So let's get back to the VS Code. Inside this page we are going to create another component, so we don't need to create another file for this component, and this component is going to be the title, which as I said is going to be something like this and this. Okay, now I'm going to say const title and set it to a component, and it returns a div here. So let's put a div here, and inside the div we are going to render a h2, and actually it will contain the title text. So here in the components, let's have a prop here. We're going to create a inline type for the props object. It is going to have a title, which is going to be a string, and then we can extract the title from the props. And inside this h2, we're going to render the title. Okay, and let's save this. Also, let's set the class name. Let's go for the size of the text, which is going to be text XL, font bold, and also text slate 700. And after the h2 we are going to have an hr, a horizontal line, and let's set the class name. We're going to have the border and border solid, and also let's go for the color of the border, which in our case is going to be border slate 300. Okay, let's save this, and now we can use the title component in the card here, which is the info panel. So let's put the title and set the title prop to features, and let's go to the browser to see what's going on there. This is the final version, and this is the page that we are creating. So we need to add some padding in the info panel. go to the card component, set the class name, and add p5 for the padding. Let's get back to the browser. Now it's better and we can see the horizontal line after the title. So now if I go to the final version, we need to create an attribute component that looks like this. Okay, so I get back to the VS Code, and after the title component, we're going to create another component called attribute. So I'm going to say const attribute, and it is going to render a div element. So let's save this. Okay, and inside the div, we are going to have two span elements. In the first one, we are going to render the label of the attribute, and in the second one, we're going to render the value of the attribute. So let's copy the span and let's define the props of the component. We are going to have an inline type for the props. It is going to have a label, which is going to be string, and also it is going to have a value, which is going to be string as well. Okay, now we can access to the label and value from the props of the component. As I said, in the first span, we're going to render the label, and in the second one, we're going to render the value. We need to style these two components. So let's save this here in the parent div. We're going to have flex because we are going to put them side by side. And also we need to push the first span to the left side of the parent div and the second one to the right side of the parent div. So we need to justify between class here. It will push them to the sides of the parent div. And now let's put a class name for these two span. Let's have multiple cursors here. And now we can simultaneously put the class name for the two span elements. We're going to have text SM for the text size and text slate 600 for the color. So let's save this, and now we can go back to the info panel, and after the features title, we're going to put our attributes. So here we're going to have our first attribute, set the label to bedrooms, and set the value to our property object that feature that bedrooms. Okay, we have an error here, and that's because the type of the value is string, but here the type of the bedroom is number or undefined. So get back here. First, we're gonna have a union type of a string or a number for the value, and let's mark it with the optional. So here, as you can see, the error is gone. We're gonna have the second attribute, which is for bathrooms. So here we'll change the label, and also in the value we're going to set it to feature.bathrooms. We're going to have another one for the parking spots, change the label to parking spots, and also value to feature.parking spots. And then we're going to have the last one in this section. It is going to be for the area, and here we need to change the label accordingly. We're going to set it to area. Okay, let's get back to browser. Okay, as you can see, it is working well. And then if I go to the final version, we're going to have the address section. So let's get back to the VS Code, and we're going to have a title here again and set the title prop to address. Okay, let's have the attributes. So let's copy this one, and the first one is going to be city, and we are going to change the value to property.location.city. We're going to have another one. It is going to be landmark, so location.landmark, and the label must be changed accordingly, landmarks. Let's have another one. It is for the zip code, and we're going to have the zip code in the label. Okay, and we're going to have the last one, which is going to be street address, or we just go for the address and set it to location.street address. Let's save this and go back to the browser. You can see we have the address and its attributes, but we kind of need a space between the feature and address. So I get back to the VS Code, and in the title we must set a class name with some margin. So I get back to the title component. Here let's define a class name for it, which is going to be optional, and also its type is string. Then here in the div, we are going to set the class name to just class name from the props. So first let me extract it from the props here and then put it here in the title. So let's get back to the address title, and we can pass the class name here. We're going to set it to margin top 7. Okay, now let's get back to the browser, and now we can see it is much better. And let's go to the final version. We should add another section for the owner details. So I get back to VS Code, and let's just copy this section and put it here. First, we are going to set the title of the title component to owner details. Okay, and here in the first attribute, we're going to have the owner name. Okay, and then here we're going to set the value to property.contact.name, and the second one is going to be property.contact.email, and let's change the label to email as well. The third one is going to be contact.phone number, so phone, and we're going to have the label with a phone text, and then we don't need the last attribute, so I'm going to delete that. Okay, and as the last thing inside this card, let's have a flex, and flex cool for the direction of the flex system, so we can put a gap of 1 between the elements of the card component. So now here we have much better looking panel attribute. Okay, now in this section we are going to create the image slider here, just like the final version of the page. So here I go to the Asserternity UI. It's a nice component library for the Next.js and React, which pretty all of its components are animated. So I go to the components section here and scroll down for the image slider here, and you can see the image slider preview. So this component library is a highly customizable library. It means that it provides the React code for the component itself. So we can actually customize the component if we want. All we need to install in our application is to install the Framer Motion, Class X, and Tailwind Merge. Fortunately, we have installed these 3 packages when we installed the NextUI component library. So we don't need to install anything in our project. And here is the cn function which is required for this component library. Also, cn function is installed in our project when we have installed the NextUI component library. So we don't want to write this code in our project, and then we just need to copy the code here for the image slider. So I get back to VS Code and I go to the components library in the app directory. Here we're going to create another component. I'm going to call it image slider.tsx and just copy the code for creating the image slider. Okay, here in importing the cn, let's remove this cn function, and here just import the cn function from the NextUI/React. Okay, and just to show you that we can customize this component, we can also turn the root div of this image slider to a card component that comes from the NextUI. Okay, so I close this off and let's get back to our property details page. And here, as you can see, we have a to do here. We need to put the image slider here, so let's remove that. And here we need to render the image slider. We're going to set the images. If I hover on that, you can see it takes a list of string, which is the URL of the images. So we need to pass the list of image URLs. So if I pass the property.images, it will give us an error. And that's because property.images contains a list of objects that contains property ID, URL, and property ID. So we just need to return a list that contains just these image URLs. So I get back to VS Code, and here I'm going to map through the images list, get the img as the parameter of the callback, and then just return img.url. As you can see, the error is gone. So let's save this and go back to the browser. Okay, as you can see, we have the image slider here. And if I go back to the final version, we just need to render the price, the status of the property, and also the description here. So I get back to the VS Code. Here after the image slider, we need to render a h2 element, and inside it we are going to render the properties.price. Before the property.price, let's put a $sign and then a slash, and then we just need to render the property.status. and then that value. We need to set the class name for the h2 text 2xl, for the text size font bold, and also text gray 700, and a margin top, for example, MT7. So let's save this, and after the h2 we're going to render a p tag, and inside it we are going to render the property description. So I'm going to say property dot description here. Just add the class name here for the p tag, text sm for the size of the text, and text slate 600, and a margin top 7. Okay, so let's save this and let's go to the browser. This is the final version and this is our version. You can see the price and also the status of the property, and you can see here the property description. So yeah, that's it for the property details page, and in the next section we are going to implement the edit property functionality for this application. Okay, this video is now more than 2 hours, so I will upload the rest of this tutorial in the next video. So see you in the next one, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support me. Have a nice time. Bye bye.